This morning is the 7th out of 9 series we're calling Abide, which is leading up to and culminating in the Abide conference. And yes, this morning we're talking about money and giving as a particular application of that. Necessary topic for the life of the disciple. I offered this morning's topic to Randy Spate. He said, no, Dave, you can do that one. It's hard to teach on sometimes because, actually, I know why, but it's not important why. But it's important. It's something that we cannot talk about discipleship without talking about money, which is common to all of us in this room, no matter what our station. At a Cenex convenience store just last spring, 7 people were taken to the hospital as a result of a mysterious symptoms experienced by a cashier. It started when one particular customer went to the counter, paid for their purchase with cash. The currency in question was laced with a thin layer of white powder, and when the cashier received it, she felt a burning sensation on her hands. The cashier was prompted by a paramedic who happened to be on the scene to rapidly wash her hands, but the burning symptom persisted. So she drove herself to the hospital. After a hazmat team arrived to conduct an initial analysis, they similarly advised the other 6 customers in the store to seek urgent care also. Their fears eventually abated after all 7 were released from the hospital, and the sheriff's office released a concluding statement to the public saying there was no imminent danger. As it turned out, the white powder was simply a form of carbohydrate, just a food compound to which the cashier had a very severe allergy. We knew it wasn't airborne because the only person with symptoms was the cashier who held the money. The other employees were perfectly fine, the sheriff said. She had to be allergic to the powder. All the symptoms matched an allergic reaction. We just had to make sure it wasn't a threat to others. Money can cause people to react in different ways. Sometimes healthy, sometimes toxic. But you don't know how you'll respond until you are put to the test, until you actually have some money to touch and to use, to save, spend, or give. Experience tells us your attitude toward wealth and possessions is vital to any discussion of being a follower of Jesus Christ, because our attitude toward material things has a big influence on our relationship with God. Many of us know Christians who in their youth were all out for God, all about following Jesus, who later on became very lukewarm in their commitment as they grew older, maybe even fell away entirely. And a major cause for this slide was an unchristian attitude towards money, towards wealth, towards possessions. So the question for us this morning: how can we handle our money in ways that honor God? Whether we have a lot of it or we have a little of it, doesn't matter. How do we handle our money in ways that honor God? Well, the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy, his protege, who was serving the church in Ephesus in the first century, and explained to him some very pointed and very practical applications of how to handle money in ways that honor God. If you have a Bible with you, this would be a great time for you to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 6. Paul's first letter to Timothy, chapter 6. If you don't have a Bible on you, that's all right. We'll have the text up here on screen for you to follow along. This is the Apostle Paul writing to Timothy, and what's just happened is he's just warned Timothy against false teachers who are trying to get rich off their teaching. And then he says, 1 Timothy 6, verse 6, "But godliness with contentment is great gain." Godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. All right, what is Paul saying? He is saying we honor God with our money by practicing contentment. We honor God with our money by practicing contentment. This is a very countercultural message. What does Paul mean when he's talking about Christian contentment? Well, the Greek word that he uses here, autarkia, originally carried the Stoic idea of self-sufficiency or self-mastery. You remember what Paul wrote in his letter to the Philippians. He said, "I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content, autarkeia, in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength." It's Philippians 4:11 through 13. So that's what Paul is talking about, but the Christian concept isn't just Stoic self-mastery. He also adds this idea of joyful contentment. There's an aspect of joy in here, because Christians believe that a good God is in control of all of life. In every situation, this good God works for the good of those who love him, and in every circumstance, good, bad, or indifferent, God is working out his purposes. So Christian contentment is more than just kind of a stoic detachment. It's joyous acceptance of every situation of life. It's not fatalism. There are some who, when something bad happens, a bad turn of fortune, they'll just say, well, it is what it is. Or a Hindu might say, well, this is just my karma, or this is my fate, or it is the will of Shiva. A Muslim might say, well, it is the will of Allah. But not so followers of Christ, because we base our living on the premise that a good and loving God is in charge of our lives and everything. We are masters of circumstance because God is master of everything. And when we learn this, it can liberate us from anxiety and from discontentedness. Our contentment in life is essentially contentment in Christ. Our contentment in life is contentment in him. And then Paul gives 3 reasons for practicing contentment in Christ. The first is you can't take it with you. Can't take it with you. We brought nothing into this world and we can take nothing out of it. Paul says material possessions have only to do with this life. You had nothing when you were born. You will take nothing with you out of this world. So that can't be what life is all about. Christ presented the same principle in Luke 12. He said, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A person's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Yes, we can rejoice over material success, and yes, we can be sorrowful over material setbacks or downturns. This is God's creation. Money is God's creation. We have to take it seriously, but we don't take it so seriously that we let its presence or absence control us. Several years ago, construction workers were laying a foundation for a building outside of Pompeii in Italy, and they found the corpse of a woman who must have been fleeing from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but was caught in the rain of hot ash. And this woman's hands clutched jewels which had been preserved in excellent condition. She had the jewels, but death had her. Death had stolen it all, and that's the bottom line in life, isn't it? I mean, worldly treasure is not a wise investment because you can't take it with you. That's the first reason. The second reason for practicing contentment is that God provides our basic needs. God provides. If we have food and clothing, we will be content with that, Paul writes. And the Bible often lumps food and clothing together as kind of the minimum requirements for life, and the Greek word for clothing actually means covering. And so we would also probably be legitimate in including shelter, that food, clothing, and shelter. Food and covering. 3 basic necessities. God has promised to provide his children. God will provide that. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things," meaning food and clothing, "will be given to you as well." So what do we do if God allows us to have something beyond our basic necessities? Hey, we gratefully accept it as a blessing from God and try to use it responsibly and be good stewards of that. But we can be content even with just the basics. Here's the problem, though. Our category of basic needs does not always correspond to God's category of basic needs, does it? We have a way of convincing ourselves many luxuries are actually necessities, especially if they're things that our friends, our neighbors already have and we don't. A person's estimate of their needs and God's assessment of the needs, when those things don't agree, discontentment results. Such a person is unhappy with what God's provided because he thinks it's not good enough. He may try to acquire more than God wants for them to have. He may succeed in this. God allows us to disobey him or to behave foolishly, gives us freedom. But no one can disobey God without losing contentment, without losing peace that a godly disciple has. The idea of being content with just basic necessity. I mean, what do you need really in your life? I mean, really? No, really. I mean, there's a lot of things that that I have that are my possessions, that if they were taken from me, or if they were stolen from me, I would be upset. But if I just lost them through some natural occurrence, I'm like, well, I'm sad about that, or I regret that, but I can live without that. I can live without that. There's a frightening number of possessions in all of our houses or all of our apartments that, yeah, we could live without. As Jerry Seinfeld said, that's the problem. There's too many things. Just got too many things out there. Your house, he says, is just a processing center for the garbage dump. Everything you get in, bring your house, put it on the kitchen table. This is the place of honor for the new acquisition. But then it moves from there into a closet, a cabinet, or cupboard. We have those so we don't see the mistakes we've made in all our purchases. And then after a while, it moves into the garage. Oh, and it won't be long now. Stay in the garage a long time, but no possession ever comes back from the garage into the house. Once it's out there where the garbage cans are, it won't be long, Jerry Seinfeld says. In fact, maybe the word garage is related to the word garbage. We have to remember that Christ, the perfect human, when he lived in this world, he enjoyed only the barest of necessities. And he was content. Third reason for practicing contentment. 1, you can't take it with you. 2, God promises to provide. 3, greed leads to grief. Greed leads to grief. Paul says, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Does wealth, fame, and success fill the emptiness that's in the human heart? 2 contemporary celebrities seem to have everything, have made it, wealthy beyond imagination. Both shared a similar truth. First, Tom York, frontman of the band Radiohead, said, I thought when I got to where I wanted to be, everything would be different. I thought I'd be somewhere else. I thought it would be all white, fluffy clouds. And then I got there, and I'm still here. And the interviewer asked, well, why in the end have you done what you've done? And York says, it's filling the hole. That's all anyone does. Well, what happens to the hole, the interviewer said. After a long pause, York said, it's still there. More recently, NBA superstar Kevin Durant was asked about why the sudden spike in technical fouls and ejections that he'd been experiencing as a defending champion. And Kevin Durant said, yes, my emotions and my passion for the game. After I won my first championship, I learned that much hadn't changed. I thought it would fill a certain void. It didn't. Recently, Angie and I watched the movie All the Money in the World, starring Christopher Plummer, who's playing the millionaire J. Paul Getty. And it's based on a true story where Getty's grandson was kidnapped and held for ransom. The kidnappers knew whose grandson he was. And Getty was so enamored with his wealth, he refused to even consider paying the ransom. And the rationale that he gave was, well, then other people are going to try to get at my wealth by kidnapping my grandchildren. And it's not that his concern for his grandson, whether he did the right thing or not, his concern for the grandson was secondary to his concern for maintaining his wealth. And at the end of the movie, Getty has died, and his entire estate, this opulent mansion and all these art treasures are being just carried out for auction. can't take it with you. And what good does it do you if you get it? And let me ask you a question. How much would it take for you to have enough? How much money would it take for you to have enough money? Mentally, come up with a figure in your head. Because the studies have been done asking people this question, and they show that most people, regardless of income, answer the question the same way. They say, I need 10% more to be comfortable. I need to make 10% more to feel comfortable. 10% will make a difference whether the responder is earning $30,000 or $60,000 or $250,000 or a cool million. All of them say, you know what, I could do with another 10%. And when people are asked the same question over time, research shows that once they've gotten that additional 10%, which usually will happen over the course of a few years, they still want just another 10%. It never stops. It just goes on and on and on, ad infinitum. And a British psychoanalyst made the following observation. It says, by its very nature, greed is endless. It's never assuaged. And by becoming form of the impulse to live, it ceases only with death. And Paul calls this pursuit of riches a temptation and a trap. And he says the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Money, which God intends to be a means of supporting life, becomes the end in itself. Money becomes the motivation, and moral principles become unimportant as making money becomes most important. And all kinds of evil can result from this. Now, Paul doesn't say that money itself is evil. He says the love of money is a root of evil. He doesn't say that all evil comes from the love of money. He says the love of money results in all kinds of evil, and consider them. The rampant dishonesty and corruption that plagues nations of the third world, and sometimes this nation. Or the sin of self-centeredness when people don't find the time to help others or serve God because they're so busy making money. Or the sin of exploitation when employers underpay workers to create more profits for themselves. Or the sin of envy and jealousy over another's financial prosperity. Or the disharmony and conflict in families over the distribution of family wealth. Families have been torn apart over this. And all these evils arise where? From the love of money. So it's not surprising, Paul says, some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. At some point they took a wrong turn and they traveled a path that took them farther and farther away from Christ in pursuit of what the Bible calls mammon, money. And the verb wandered away is in the passive voice, suggests that they're helpless, they're out of control because of their deception. They decided to follow mammon and now their lives are controlled by its principles. They're hooked on it. They have no strength to resist. That's all they know. But wealth will never bring true contentment. A person who has tasted the abundant life in Christ will never be satisfied to leave that and pursue other things, no matter how successful they become in this world. Only Christ can satisfy our deepest yearnings. In the book Break Open the Sky, Steve Ballman describes the opening scene of a documentary where we're introduced to Manoj Singh, a rickshaw driver from India. Manoj lives with his wife and 3 children in a one-room home constructed of rusted corrugated metal held together with plastic tarps. When asked about his life, he said, I am not poor, I am the richest person. Manoj, you see, is a Christian. He proudly talks about his work as a rickshaw driver in the crowded streets, the monsoons, sweltering heat, the occasional abuse from drunk passengers. These are mere inconveniences to him. He said his home is good, even though it doesn't really protect his family that well from the monsoons. And sometimes they can only afford to eat some rice with a little bit of salt. But we are still happy, Manoj said. Somehow in the midst of all this, Manoj is happy. Maybe he knows something we don't. This is Paul's advice to those who are aspiring to be rich. Practice contentment. And next, he gives special advice to those who are already rich on how to honor God with their money. And I think this has even greater relevance, more relevance to those of us with the wealth we have today. Verse 17, skip down to verse 17, Paul continues, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Second way we honor God with our money is by practicing generosity. We honor God with our money by practicing generosity. And Paul gives a hint to his perspective on wealth by describing the wealthy as those who are rich in this present world. He's alluding to the fact there's another type of wealth that's nobler and even more important than what this material world has to offer. Because material wealth lasts only for this life, and this life will eventually end. So like physical beauty or athletic talent, wealth is a temporary blessing. Wealth is a temporary blessing. And some people who are not rich materially are actually very rich from the perspective of eternity in what ultimately matters. All right, now Paul is talking to those who are rich. And we see from this passage, Paul doesn't demand that all wealthy Christians renounce all their wealth. It's not what he says. But he shows us a superior value system, God's mind on it, according to which material wealth is not as significant as we often make it out to be. Massachusetts Library was forced to make a public statement recently when it noticed a growing trend of library patrons trying to pay library fines and printing fees with tokens from the restaurant and arcade Chuck E. Cheese, located not far away. The Peabody Institute Library posted on Facebook a reminder that the tokens, while perhaps worth something in the walls of Chuck E. Cheese, are not actually legal tender and therefore cannot be accepted as payment for library fines. Apparently, Chuck E. Cheese has been phasing out the use of coin-like tokens in favor of digital credits, and maybe that's why people are trying to use them for other things. But Jesus preaches in the Sermon on the Mount, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal." It's easy for us to forget the treasures of this life are temporary. Wealth is a temporary blessing. And that lasting eternal treasures come from the one who is the way and the truth and the life. In verses 18 and 19, Paul says, actually twice in this passage, these 3 verses, he says, command. Tells Timothy, command the rich. Command the rich. It doesn't say suggest. It doesn't say imply. It says command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant or put their hope in wealth. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. Good deeds are required of every Christian, no matter our station in life. These often take the form of little things done for people to bring them joy or to lighten their load. It's the kind of thing we have in mind when we talk about love alive. It's going into the community and doing good for the glory of God. And Paul says, before he even asks the rich to give, he tells them to be rich in good deeds. It's not enough for them to just sort of dole out funds in a detached way. Yeah, I'll just write a check for this. Yeah, I'll just write a check for that. He wants them to be involved with doing good and acts of kindness because it helps others and keeps them grounded. And he says, be generous. Command them to be generous and to share with others. Some people lavish themselves with good things, but Christians are to be lavish in the way we give. We have Jesus Christ as our example, who, though he was rich, yet for our sakes became poor. A New Jersey man spent decades stockpiling rations and resources for an eventual doomsday. He was a doomsday prepper. And recently he donated almost all of it to the Puerto Rican hurricane crisis. 74-year-old Joseph Badame and his wife had spent decades putting together all the pieces you'd typically find in a doomsday hideout. The bomb shelter, an extra kitchen, bathroom, survivalist books. Most impressive part was the food that they had gathered over the years. They had 80 barrels of food, which reportedly could sustain 84 people for up to 4 months. But times have been tough for this family for quite a while. Joseph met a Puerto Rican couple who were raising money for their country's disaster relief. Joseph's wife had been sick for years, and her care consumed all of their time and all their resources until she eventually passed away, leaving Joseph broke and exhausted, and the bank even threatened foreclosure on his property, which is when he met this Puerto Rican couple and decided he had a new purpose in life. He said, "Phyllis and I prepared all this for one group of people, and it turns out it's going to help another group of people." He said, "I think that's wonderful." As followers of Christ, we're commanded to love those around us by living sacrificially. And in some scenarios, that might mean letting go of the resources that we spent a long time accumulating for the glory of God and to benefit others. Not long ago, this past summer, a suburban Chicago woman was left stunned when one of her patrons left a combined tip of over 1,000% of his bill. Nicole Thompson, a teacher who worked a second job as a bartender to help pay the bills, received two separate tips from one person, one for $500 and a second for $1,000. Nicole said, "I can't take this," and he said, "Oh yes, you can." This generous man is the boss of a friend of Nicole Thompson's, simply said he had heard that she worked two jobs, thought she could use this. Nicole said, "The rest of the day I felt completely different. Like, what just happened here? I never anticipated that." The owner of the restaurant publicly thanked the man, saying, "Although I've never met you, your act of kindness is inspiring." Surprising generosity of one man has made national news, has likely impacted this woman's life significantly. She'll never forget that. And perhaps a good question for us to ask then is, why don't we hear more news stories about the overwhelming generosity of Christians, the overwhelming generosity of churches? I have a friend in North Carolina who was a farmer, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Money is like manure. If you spread it out, it can do a lot of good. If you pile it up, it just stinks." Right? I thought about putting a picture of manure up here, but you're welcome. Money is like manure. You spread it out, it can do a lot of good. You pile it up, you hoard it, it just stinks. So many of you in this room give faithfully, even sacrificially, to the Lord's work through New Hope Church. And I don't know who gives what, but I want to say thank you. I know you know who you are, if I don't. And the Lord knows who you are, and the Lord sees what you do, and He smiles on it. Because you give faithfully and you give sacrificially to this ministry and this body and to God's work. And then there are some of you in this room are not giving very much, or you're not giving at all. And I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to tell you you're missing out. You're missing out. You're missing out on God's will for you and God's best for you and the joy that can come from being generous. There's a joy in giving generously, and I can stand here with integrity and tell you I know what I'm talking about, because on this issue at least, I practice what I preach. Some of you will say, "Well, times are tight for me," or "I'm just starting out." And you'll say, "I'll start giving when I can afford to." But that's a lie. That's a lie. You're just kidding yourself. Or if you and your spouse say, we'll start giving when we can afford to. That's not true. Because you're never going to come to a point where you feel like you can afford to. Won't there always be something that's screaming louder for your money than the Lord's work? Something to repair, or something to pay off, or something to purchase, and something we've been talking about. No, start today. Start now. Even if it's just a very tiny amount. Start the discipline of worshiping God by giving. Start practicing generosity by giving. And if you need some help with figuring out how to do that, like we said earlier, Financial Peace University starts in 2 weeks. It's good stuff. And we're offering the course here again, and we have people who are happy to coach you in getting to a place where, yeah, you feel like not only I can afford to give, but I want to, because I have put contentment and generosity into practice. That's our big idea from 1 Timothy 6. Let's put contentment and generosity into practice. These are countercultural values. Our world does not uphold these as good or admirable things, but they are. God upholds them. Jim Elliot, a missionary who was martyred for his faith, understood this reality when he wrote in his journal, "A person is no fool to give what he cannot keep in order to gain what he cannot lose." Giving is an investment in eternal realities, laying up for yourselves treasures in heaven. It's not foolish to give up what you cannot keep in order to gain what you cannot lose. Suppose you were to buy shares of stock in Apple. What's going to happen? Well, suddenly you develop interest in Apple. You check the financial pages, you see a magazine article about Apple, and you read every word, even though a month ago you'd have passed right by it. Suppose you're giving to help African children with AIDS, and when you see an article on the subject, you're hooked. If you're sending money to plant churches in India and an earthquake hits India, you watch the news and you start praying fervently, whereas before you would have paid it no mind. If you wished you cared more about eternal things, reallocate some of your money, maybe most of your money, to eternal things. Put your resources, your assets, your money, your possessions, your time, your talents and energies into the things of God. Watch what happens. Watch what happens. As surely as the compass needle follows north, your heart will follow your treasure. Money leads, hearts follow. Let's put contentment and generosity into practice as God's people. Will you pray with me?